Okay, thank you all very much for being here. Welcome to this panel discussion this morning on climate change and India. This year, most parts of the world will have experienced the hottest summers in their history. The United Nations Secretary General at the UN Climate Ambition Summit 2 weeks back put the problem as follows, and I'm quoting him. He said, "Our task is urgent. Humanity has opened the gates of hell. Horrendous heat is having horrendous effects. Distraught farmers watching crops carried away by floods, sweltering temperatures spawning disease, and thousands fleeing in fear as historic fires rage. Climate action is dwarfed by the scale of the challenge," unquote. Now, I think we all know that this problem of climate change is attributable to global warming, caused by the dramatic increase in greenhouse gas emissions, emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases, largely attributable to human activity. And so we are seeing a range of mitigation responses to cut greenhouse gas emissions, as well as, very importantly, adaptation responses to prepare for the adverse impacts of climate change. Across the developed world, many governments have embraced relatively aggressive net zero carbon emission targets, typically centered around the year 2050, 2050. And huge financial outlays accompany these, from the $1 trillion linked to the European Green Deal to the $370 billion outlay for climate and clean energy in the United States Inflation Reduction Act. Many large global asset owners have started decarbonizing their portfolios, and customers are also beginning to influence change, reflected, for instance, in Unilever's decision that every one of its 70,000 consumer products would start carrying labels showing their carbon footprint so that customers can make informed choices. Now, where does India stand amidst all of these trends? We certainly have had our share of extreme climatic events, including some of the unfortunate events recently in the area of Sikkim. In Mumbai, the city I normally live in, these past few years have seen cyclones for the first time in over a century. The fact is, India has today become the third largest greenhouse gas producer in the world, after China and the United States. And with a great deal of energy-intensive growth still lying ahead of us, we will be key to how the world will resolve the problem of global warming. And this is the reason that the Indian government has enhanced its earlier targets announced at the Paris Climate Accord in 2015. It has now declared that 2070 will be the target date for achieving net zero status. But more proximate, by 2030, that's the end of this decade, it has promised to generate 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel-based energy, with 50% of the energy mix coming from renewables by the same year, and committed to improve the energy efficiency of the economy by 45% over 2005 levels by 2030. It has also promised to add, through carbon sinks, additional forest and tree cover that can capture at least 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon emissions by the end of this decade. And it has called for the adoption of life or lifestyle for environment by all countries so that human consumption behavior comes to be in sync with the carrying capacity of the natural environment. So with that context, in our panel this morning, we're going to try and discuss what climate change really means for India and for different stakeholder constituencies. Both my panelists, Mridula and Sukumar, are experts who have written extensively on this subject. So I'm going to ask them a bunch of questions over the next 40-odd minutes, and then we will leave time at the end for questions from the audience. I'm going to start by asking both of you questions related to your research, and a fair amount of this, of course, focuses on the past, and it's always a good idea to see what we can learn from the past and how we apply it to the present and the future. So let me start with Mridula. Climate change is going to impact the basic human need for water, and a lot of your research has been on water. India today, with around a fifth of the world's population, makes do with less than 1/20th of the world's renewable water resources. You've written with great admiration about the traditional Indian water storage and tank systems. So tell us what we can learn from Indian traditions of water management. Mridula?
Thanks, Mukund, for setting the context. Thanks, Ooty Literature Festival, for inviting me. And thank you all for being here. So, my first book was on climate change. And in my opinion, the second book was also on climate change, except everyone says it's on water. But the popular saying goes, if climate change is a shark, then water is its teeth. And in India, we should know precisely how those teeth are going to bite. Because, you know, it's not as though every country's water is the same. And India's water in particular is so dramatically different that it's important to consider what makes it different. So let me give you an analogy, right? India has one of the most seasonal waters in the world, right? We get most of our rainfall in about 100 hours. Many Indian cities get 40, 50 rain days, but you drink water every day. You go to the bathroom every day, which means you need water all the time. There are places in India which get 165 millimeters of rain. There are places in India which get 5 meters of rainfall in a matter of months. One size does not fit all. So what we used to do, when you look at some of the structures like Eris and Kurams and Kammais and Uranis and Cherus and all of those, they really understood the facets of India's water. Okay, and they worked with the facets. If it's so seasonal and you need to use it every day, what do you do with the water? You store it, right? One thing that we looked at is we studied about 100 such tank systems. The lakes are called tanks. And we found they are wonderful at recharging groundwater. We found on average, a functional tank kept groundwater up by 200 feet, which is a lot, right? And so what does climate change do? What is the climate change connection? Climate change is broadly understood to make dry regions drier. It makes dry seasons drier. And when it rains, it pours, right? So take the Chennai floods. A lot of you might, from Bangalore especially, will be saying, okay, parvala Madras thane. But I see some people from Madras also here, so you will care. T Nagar in Madras used to be a giant lake, right? 2 miles by 3 miles wide. The Chennai Regatta held their winter regatta rally there. Of course, it's no longer a lake, it's a neighborhood. And it was built in a low-lying area to catch the rain. So, he's going to talk about it soon. Climate has changed in the past, and this was meant to help you cope with it. But if you build over a lake, you've just destroyed your armor again when the enemy is coming at you. And it's not just the tanks. If you take the Kallanai, you take, many of the ancient engineering, they worked with the facets of water, and that kept us climate resilient. Today, our dams don't quite work with the facets of water, and they make us climate vulnerable.
Thanks so much, Mridula. In fact, just to quote from a piece that Mridula wrote, she says, "Make no mistake, our ancient tanks or anecuts may not have IoT or machine learning or blockchain, but you will have to search hard to find a technology better suited to managing India's volatile and variable water than the humble tank." So the point is, I think, local solutions, very simple solutions are available, if only we reinvested in the traditional knowledge that already exists. I'm going to come back to you, Mridula, in a few minutes. But Sukumar, we are in the Nilgiris, a lovely part of the country. You've been studying peat deposits in the valleys of this region and reconstructing climatic and vegetation changes. What learnings have you drawn about historical climate change here and the impact on vegetation species diversity? And if we were to extrapolate through the rest of this century, what impacts of climate change do you think we might anticipate in the Nilgiris?
Yeah, thank you, Mukund. Almost anything that I do starts with the elephant. And my foray into climate change also started with an elephant in August 1982. In 1982 was a drought year. You know, if you, the old timers will remember, it was an El Nino year, which is again started now, right now. And 1982 has been described as the most intense El Nino of the 20th century. Now, when I said it started with an elephant, it started with a dead elephant. And this dead elephant was found in Kunda, not very far from Ooty, right here in the Nilgiris. So I had accompanied the forest department, the wildlife veterinary team to go and do the postmortem. And this dead elephant calf was in a valley. And it was August 1982. There weren't much rains, still it was cold and a bit windy. And as we trekked into the valley, I realized that it was very difficult to walk in this valley because of the very, very soft soil. You know, this was a peat bog. My thoughts then went back to a very interesting debate between an Indian forester, C.R. Ranganathan, and a European botanist called N.L. Bohr about the origin of the sholas and the grasslands in the Nilgiris. You know, I come from a background in botany, and I will not get into details of this right now. Essentially, what C.R. Ranganathan had said was that the grasslands of the Nilgiris are natural grasslands set by the climate. While Bohr said that, no, Ranganathan is all wrong. It is people have come and people have cleared the shola forest. The entire plateau was covered with shola forest. So they came in 2,000 years ago and they cleared the Thodas came and cleared the entire area, and therefore you have the grasslands today. So apart from doing the postmortem of the elephant, I realized that this was a scientific archive. This peat bog was a scientific archive. And by that, let me explain. The peat bogs here go back to 40,000 years before present. I knew about radiocarbon dating. So I tucked away this idea at the back of my mind as to see whether in the past, how much of pollen do you get? Do you get tree pollen or do you get grass pollen? To try and settle the Ranganathan and Bohr debate. It took another 9 years before I had finished my PhD, joined the faculty of the Indian Institute of Science, set up my research station in Masnagudi, and then came up with a small team of, I had a geophysicist to help me, and we went and we started sampling these peat bogs and, started dating them. And these dates went back to 40,000 years before present. Okay, at that time I did not know. It went back to 40,000 years. And then the story, we used a technique, a high sophisticated chemical technique. I don't want to bore you with the details, called stable carbon isotopes. And as the story kind of came together, it gave a kind of it paralleled what is known globally about natural climate change. So we have had, the last 10,000 years we call the Holocene. We've actually lived in an era of, very, very stable climate. And that's why we have the rise of civilizations, agriculture is made possible, and all that we know about our civilization is made possible in the last 10,000 years. You go back 20,000 years before present, the earth was much colder than what it is today. It's 5 degrees Celsius on average colder. And Nilgiris may have been even colder than that. It was an intense cold period. And the whole of India, globally, and so on and so forth. The monsoon was much weaker. 10,000 years ago, the monsoon was much stronger. So you've had a picture where you have natural climate change, which has nothing to do with humans. It is kind of pre-anthropogenic, pre-industrial revolution, emissions of greenhouse gases, and so on and so forth. So what, the lesson that this taught me is that in the background, we have natural climate change. It is set by the Earth's orbit around the sun, and everything is affected. So the Nilgiris was warmer, 7,000, 8,000 years ago. 20,000 years ago, the Nilgiri was a very, very cold place. And maybe if you go back 50,000 years ago, again, it was colder. So we go through these periods of warmth and cold. Okay. Now, that does not by itself help you when we talk about today's climate change, because now you say, okay, it doesn't matter. I mean, 20,000 years ago, there were a few 10,000 people in this whole on Earth. And today we are 8 billion people, and the Nilgiri population itself is several million. So then, I started looking at how was climate change in the last maybe a century or so. And presently, how are the forests of the Nilgiris, being impacted by climate change? Now, the first thing that I learned was that the grasslands were there much before there's evidence for any humans. So C.R. Ranganathan, our forester, he was a brilliant intellectual, and he was actually absolutely right about the origin of the grasslands, although we followed a very different path. We thought that the European botanists had to be right, and therefore we started planting wattle and, in fact, destroying the grasslands, which has changed the hydrology of the region. So on the one hand, I started looking at the dynamical changes. So this is a dynamical system, but then about 100 years ago, we started changing the system further by planting acacia, all the exotic species. We started planting eucalyptus, and mostly on the grasslands, by the way, and we have started changing the hydrology. Now, coming to how climate has changed in India and what the future is going to hold, the temperatures in India have changed by more than 1 degree, in tune with the global change. Okay, now that's something that's already done. I started thinking about this issue 30 years ago. What will happen to the Nilgiris with global warming? Okay. I realized, and I wrote a paper about this a long time ago, saying that with global warming, you will actually create conditions where frost will not occur in the Nilgiris and the upper Nilgiris during the winter, and this will set a stage for the wattle to start expanding over this given area. I then started putting in a program of long-term climate change by starting to study the forest in detail, and we actually find now in the last 30, 40 years, the rainfall in the Western Ghats has actually been declining. Now, this is something that has an important lesson for all of us in the southern Western Ghats. The rainfall has changed in a very complex manner across the country. I will not talk about that. We know that temperature has changed, the rainfall has increased in certain areas, rainfall has declined in certain other regions. But what is more important to us in the southern Western Ghats is the last 30 to 40 years, the rainfall has consistently declined. But the variability has increased. So you have these episodes of very intense rainfall, like what happened in Kerala in 2018, and all the big floods that happened. Avalanche a few years ago, there was very, very intense rainfall. I think second or third or the fourth most intense rainfall ever recorded, an avalanche. And it did not rain in Ooty, apparently, by the way, at that given time. So the rainfall has been declining in the southern Western Ghats. The variability in the rainfall has increased, and therefore there is a potential for high episode rainfall events and extensive periods of drought. And therefore, we have to think about this in the context of hydrology, adaptation, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. So we are on notice on the issues you're going to face in this region, as indeed in every part of India. Sukumar, quick one for you, very quickly. Your research also looked at human migration. And I think you looked at the Toda pastoral community, widely regarded as the original inhabitants of the Nilgiris. So tell us very quickly what you saw with Toda migration and how it was influenced by climate change. And does human migration, is that something we need to also think about looking ahead?
See, at a very broad scale, human evolution itself has been driven by climate change. We came out of Africa because of major climate change events 70,000 years ago. Sea levels became lower and so on and so forth. But sort of extending upon that, when you look at this given region, if you look at all the historical books and what the anthropologists and historians and even the linguists have written, they have always been of the, I would say more or less opinion or whatever, that the Todas came up and settled in the Nilgiris about 2,000 years before present. So far, nobody has given a date prior to 2000 before present. The work that we have been doing in the peat bogs in Sandinella, and most recently, picked up something very, very, very interesting and very unexpected. We had one particular sequence that goes back to about 20,000 years. Sentinella, which is just a few kilometers from here. We looked at charcoal, okay, the presence of charcoal. Charcoal tells you about fires in the past. Okay. We have at 20,000 years before present, we have a small spike in charcoal, and that spike corresponds to the arid period when we were at a much colder phase. But then at 3,500 years before present, you have a huge spike in the amount of charcoal, meaning there were very, very large fires in the upper Nilgiri area. The same layer, we picked up fungal spores that are associated with the dung of herbivorous animals, meaning that this is a site of corral where the todas were probably tending their buffalo, and you get a huge spike in the amount of the fungal spores associated with that. Then there are some plant compounds, again, I will not get into the chemistry details, which are indicative of grasses. So a big spread of grassland. Then, very, very interestingly, for the first time, you pick up evidence of human fecal matter through, some fatty acids, some steroid compounds. This is very, very sophisticated technique. We had to send the samples to Sweden to get it analyzed for the first time at 3,500 years. So it's not just a coincidence that 3,500 year period, you are picking up big increase in fires, big increase in grasslands, big explosion in the population of buffaloes, and which means that, the conditions were there when intense aridity. And if you think a little more broadly, the dawn of the Vedic age is 3,500 years. So you had the Aryans coming into migrating into India 3,500 years before present. The Harappan civilization declines and is almost completed 3,500 years before present. Dr. Karatani of the French Institute picked up off the coast of Karwar 25 years ago. He had a study where he showed that the forest had become grasslands, along the coast of Karwar. It's not a coincidence. So 3,500 years ago was a momentous period in our whole South Asian, Central Asian history of climate change. And therefore, my surmise is that a pastoralist people, I'm not saying the Todas, but most likely the Todas, actually migrated up with their buffalo herds and settled down because of a big climate change event. And climate change in the future is going to cause further changes in human migration patterns around the world.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This is like Sherlock Holmes meets Greta Thunberg. I'm going to now move back to you, Mridula. I said in your research on water, one of the things that you mentioned is despite the issues that people face in access to water, there is still a huge unwillingness on the part of the majority to actually pay for water, even if it is piped to their homes regularly and comes with assurance of good quality. Now, many economists would suggest that unless you find ways to price natural resources, protection and conservation of these becomes much harder. What's your sense of what's going on, and how do we find a way out of this?
So there is, I think, Mukund, what you're referring to, my institute did a study where we've spoken to about 2,000 households in Madurai over the last 5 years, across income groups, more focused on the lower income groups, to understand what the water realities are. 60 to 70% said, we will not pay for water if it comes in a regular schedule to our house and it's of good quality. Okay, so we'll put that. This is sort of backed up by other indirect surveys by other groups across cities in India. So that's the finding. First, I want to again move back to history, because I think once you start understanding history, you come a long way. This water is free narrative in India. And if you go to any politicians, I'll say it in Tamil, "Idu enga urimai." Okay, it is a God-given right to get water. Fine, I mean, it may be. But if you go through Indian history, we've always paid a price for water. It has never been free. There are two, actually when I was reading the Arthashastra, Chanakya has a beautiful way in which he talks of pricing for water, right? It's a progressive tax. So people paid as a share of crops. It's very important. I told you that India's water is very seasonal, right? So it doesn't make sense to have a cash tax which is fixed over time, which is what the British did. It makes sense to have a share of crop because during bountiful harvests, it automatically adjusts upwards. And during years of droughts, it automatically goes down. And you know, this El Nino, La Nina thing is it's well established in India. It's a very varies across years also. So it works well. And what Chanakya did is he said, look, depending on the method you get water from the irrigation source, your tax will vary. So if you used a mechanical means, if you use technology, you would pay a higher share of your crop as tax. Whereas if you used manual labor, you would pay less. So it essentially means if you're a wealthy farmer, you'll pay more. If you're a poorer farmer, you'll pay less as a share of crop. Today, it's completely ulta. Most farmers who have bore wells tend to be the wealthier farmers. And electricity for agriculture is free. So who does it benefit? It benefits the wealthier farmers, and there's also intergenerational equity. Because if you're taking out the groundwater, and that groundwater, I know personally, I got into this field because I ran out of groundwater at home. If you're taking out the groundwater, you're leaving less for everybody else. So you're really adjusting this intergenerational equity. Now let's leave Chanakya, all of that, and come to the present day. Today there is a price being paid for water, right? You may not want to pay a formal price, but in our survey again, we found that 40% of people from Madurai were buying water. People were working as household helps, dhobis, petty shop owners. The average spend was 400 rupees. That's a lot of money per month to pay for water. And this is an informal payment to the tanker mafia. So look, a price is a signal. If you have a formal price, and what was really interesting is Israel and Singapore have taken Chanakya's words to their heads. And their systems are following what he says. We have gone the other way. So what we are signaling is what you pay, price, you're signaling what you value. And you are altering the path of innovation. So today, the way we are paying for water is we are encouraging bore wells and we are encouraging the tanker mafia. If we had a formal price for water, we would encourage analytics, we would encourage sewage treatment, we would encourage, leak detection, all of the things that Singapore and Israel, who gets far less water, would do. I'll end with this. The terrible thing is that there are large parts of the peripheries of Indian cities. And I talk about peripheries because that's where the municipal supply doesn't reach. So their only hope is groundwater. And everybody nicely pumps it up. And one day it's gone. Right? So they're living in one horrible kind of day zero situation. You don't have municipal water and you exhausted your groundwater. And 5 years ago, I invest in climate tech startups. 5 years ago, I couldn't find a water startup for love or for money. Today, there are enough water startups. It's not a good sign because there's enough people who've run out of water, which makes it worth their while to go for water startups, even though we don't have formal water pricing.
Thank you. So we need to find answers in the direction of establishing value and putting a price sometimes to these very important resources. But let's move on to where some of the other answers to tackling climate change might lie. So perhaps in corporate action, in more capital being secured for funding, including the startups you talked about, in the development of new technologies, better resource management, and more activism at the level of local communities. So Mridula, my first question is to you on corporate action. Personally, I have, with some experience, tended to be a little skeptical about the speed with which larger corporates will act. If you look at startups, on the other hand, they do tend to inspire more confidence with their nimbleness and keen desire to roll out new products and services. And perhaps nestled between the large corporates and the startups are the small and medium enterprises, or the SMEs, many of which I think are beginning to now become very anxious about their ability to actually address the challenge of climate change. What's your broad sense of this whole landscape of the business world?
Actually, here's where I'm hopeful. right? So I help run 2 companies. I invest in a lot of startups. There's good and bad news there. A lot of big companies, especially powerful brands, have realized it's really stupid to do climate foolish things. It's just dumb, okay? Because they've got a big brand. It acts like a lightning rod for protests. So they have found it worth their while to innovate their way into some form of climate positive action. The small and medium enterprises, and unfortunately we're going on a K-shaped curve, right? So you've got all these big brands sort of going this way and then the smaller brands going that way. So I'm in textiles. I kid you not, this is a summit that happened, I think 2 years ago, Global Sustainability Summit on textiles. And we had all the brands, some of which you may be wearing now. They said, yes, sustainability is so important. We care so much for planet Earth. And then I said, okay, some sustainable actions for SMEs where the profit margins are very thin do require upfront investments. I can't go to the bank and ask me to lend. Are you willing to pay more? No. Cost is very important. Otherwise, we'll move to Bangladesh, we'll move to Vietnam. So I think in the large corporate's mind, the bottleneck resources, a little bit of pay for sustainability in the short term is important. And the good news, I'll leave some good news there, look, we run a medium scale enterprise. In a few short years, we draw 70% of our power from renewable sources. Our discussion, I was just telling you outside, is whether we go from 70 to 90 or not. It's a purely business discussion we did. So it shows the level of innovation that is possible, right? Now let me come to the startups. I started investing, my first startup was actually Sahas, who does waste management, wonderful story. They started, I think when I invested in them, they were about 3 crores a year. I think last year they closed with 100 crores in revenue. Gives an idea of how this space is really moving forward. 8 years ago, if I got one startup a quarter, I thought it was a good quarter. Last week, I saw 8 startups in climate tech. It's exploding the interest. And with the interest come the charlatans. And to me, this is the biggest fear. The greenwashing is absolutely everywhere. When you say sustainability, gosh, I don't want to say something, I'm on camera, but it's just nonsense, the kind of greenwashing that goes on outside. I think you're all intelligent people, just go out, see it, you'll be able to call it, and you should call it out. Okay, thanks.
I think on that last point, at the same time, and I was also skeptical about large corporates, but I think it is worth mentioning that we are seeing strong regulatory action in the direction of mandating and tightening corporate disclosures. So the Securities and Exchange Board of India, SEBI, has mandated from this year actually, that the top 1,000 listed companies, which make up the bulk of the market cap, should produce business responsibility and sustainability reports, which have embedded in them significant climate-related disclosures. And starting from next year, in a calibrated manner, all 1,000 companies will need to eventually get these reports audited and audited to a high standard of reasonable assurance. And likewise, the Reserve Bank of India, the RBI, is beginning to now press banks and financial service institutions to really incorporate an assessment of both physical and transition risks across a range of scenarios in order to determine the resilience to financial losses. And I think what happens then with these kinds of disclosures is all of us in this room, think tanks, policy planning institutions, nonprofits, everyone is benefited by the disclosures that get made and can really hold the feet of these corporates to fire to ensure that they do better in their performance on climate risk. So I think there is also hope looking ahead. I'm going to end with 2 quick questions to my panelists and then love to get some time in for the audience also. Sukumar, we all talk a lot about technology and the solutions that technology can offer in finding solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation. You've, I know, experimented with some very elegant technology solutions in the space of conservation, around human-animal conflict, for instance. Can you elaborate on what you did in particular, but more generally also your sense of confidence that technology will help us find solutions for the climate challenge looking ahead?
I think that technology can only provide partial solutions. I think it's a matter of change in human lifestyles, human behavior, our mindsets, and so on. I think that's very, very important. Because the critical need today is drastic reduction in the amount of greenhouse gases, okay, in the atmosphere. I'm just coming in, I came in yesterday from the United States after spending 3 weeks and prior to that in Chile. And I know, if you say that the USA is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, not only in absolute terms, but also in per capita terms. I understand what it means, because I've seen places and the lifestyles there. But that apart. Coming to conflicts, the challenge with conflicts between wildlife and people is that when you deal with elephant-human conflict, the elephant is also a technologist par excellence. And the earliest technologies that were used to try to keep elephants away from crop fields was the high voltage electric fence, what is commonly called the solar powered fence today. And electricity is a subject that I neglected in high school. I didn't know anything beyond that, the electricity. You have to have a positive and a negative. I didn't know more than that. But the elephant is, I think, much better than that because it knows how to overcome an electric fence and all kinds of designs that people have tried over the last 30, 40 years. It has overcome the technology that we have come up with. It learns that the tusks are poor conductors. It learns very quickly that the soles of the feet are poor conductors. Or elephants, there's just, a female elephant that does not have tusks. It goes and locates a tree and or pulls a branch down and breaks an electric fence and so on. So it's been extremely challenging. What we have done is that in the case of a lot of the conflicts are between male elephants and, the so-called onti, anai or whatever they call it, or say a single solitary elephant. So we thought that let us try to give an advance warning to the villagers, the forest officials. So we started putting collars on elephants, with the global positioning system collars. We started this for the first time in West Bengal. In fact, as I speak now, in Assam, my team is actually trying to locate and collar 2 elephants right now, and I'm here. But that apart, they are trying to do this. But still, the real issue is you put a collar. On your mobile phone, I can actually show where exactly the elephant is, an hour ago or 2 hours ago or whatever, through an app. But then you still have to go and deal with that elephant in the evening. It's about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night, and the elephant is now moving towards a given village. You still have to go and you still have to chase the elephant. And this is a formidable 5-ton or 6-ton, a huge, large bull, and that's not very easy. Therefore, there are all kinds of alarm systems and so on and so forth. But all this has a certain role. But we should not, I would say, overemphasize the role of technology. We should know in which situation technology is going to be useful, is going to be a tool, and what the possibilities are. But there are other forms of management of this problem that we should be open to, which sometimes may not go too well with people who are too much into animal rights or animal welfare.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to end with a question to Mridula. I think in the interest of giving the audience some time. And this is a question about the political class and how it engages with the climate agenda. And my question really is, are voters impressing on our political parties the need for change? And before you answer, let me just share with you what one of the editors of a national daily was telling me. He basically said that none of the national political leaders that he has spoken to in India will accept that voters are going to be significantly influenced by sustainability considerations for at least another decade. The moment the sustainability agenda is seen to fail to deliver growth and jobs, politicians will abandon it. By the way, that in a way seems to be what we are seeing currently with Rishi Sunak, for instance, in the UK. So, question to you, what is your take on whether climate is or will ever be a voting issue in this country?
I'll just add one thing. I'm a tech aficionado, okay? And I have like several chapters on technologies in climate, water, etc. But the opening quote for that chapter is, "A fool with a tool is still a fool." So I think the context is pretty important. So with that in politics, so I know very little about politics, as I've told many people in the audience, okay? But my husband is a great aficionado of politics. So he said, look, you have to look at it. And in, a couple of years ago, when I wrote my first book, it was when, people in panels like these were asked, what should action be? It was almost shorthand to say the government should do it, right? Government should do it means government should pass policy and implement policy. So it made sense to ask, will people vote for such policy, right? So there are two data sets that I would ask you to go look at. One is by the ADR, which lists governance priorities, right? And is it drinking water? Is it jobs? Is it health? They list it across districts in India. The second thing is, I didn't know the answer, so I went and asked my institute to go and ask people. So in the middle of the worst drought, right, when many people were getting water once in 3 to 4 days, we went and asked, would you vote on water? Would water influence your vote? So we asked 900 plus people that question. 300 people asked us to go walk off. We won't answer you. In the 600 people who gave us an answer, most said no. An overwhelming majority said no. If people getting water daily, if 8% said they will vote on water, people getting water once in 4 days said 16% will vote on water. And one guy said, I will vote for the guy who diesels the tanks, which basically means you're not going to get policy, the kind of policy you want to build climate resilience. So it's not a good idea to assume that will be a solution, right? Look, politicians are really smart and they do their job right? They want to get re-elected. And with data like this, why should they do it? Their job is to get re-elected. Let's not be unreasonable. Sorry, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Sukumar.
Just half a minute, yeah. Can you just add to that? See, the relatively good news on climate change in India is that the monsoon overall will strengthen. There'll be more rains across India overall. Okay, but that's overall. There'll be geographical differences. So I think we have to learn how to harness the water where there's excess water, how to be able to supply it to places where, where people are there, or whatever. I'm not trying to give you a solution, but overall the Indian monsoon will strengthen. That's the first message. Second message is about, talking about conflicts. 1982, I mentioned, was a year of drought, an El Nino, severe drought. We saw a dispersal of elephants. Elephants from Tamil Nadu went to Andhra and started, in conflicts, very high levels of conflict. So with climate variability, there's going to be increased levels of conflicts. And that's something, the climate imprint on increased conflicts is now being seen across central India, very, very clearly. The third point I would like to observe, I'd like to make, just as she said, that solutions also have to come from local communities as to what people want. Okay, otherwise things are not going to succeed. And I think that's one aspect of conservation, conflict mitigation, you name it. We need to get the people firmly on board, we need to convince them, and we need to come up with solutions that they are comfortable with and they are happy to work with conservationist government. Otherwise everything will fail. Thank you.
Just one more point, which I forgot to mention. See, I think I've painted a fairly bleak picture. There is one ray of hope. In seats or constituencies where there is low political competition, you start seeing climate sensor and districts which are very climate vulnerable. You need both of those. Low political competition and high climate vulnerability. You start seeing very interesting climate policy come up to place.
Thank you. And in fact, I think you could make the same argument about negotiations at the international level. In a few weeks, we will have COP28, the Conference of Parties on Climate Change. And already, I think there's a lot of sense that this is going to be one more conference where key decisions will not be taken. Just to quote one of the national dailies, predictably at the meeting, vows will be made and broken. Global corporations will send spin doctors to slow down the decarbonization process. and advanced nations will use subterfuge to dodge the payment of reparations for their past misdeeds. So I think this is going to need a lot of effort at every level, at the international level, at the national level, at the very local levels, within districts, within villages. At every level, we will really need a coming together of stakeholders who care deeply about these issues. But this is very rich territory for research, for writing, for thoughts. We've covered some ground. We could keep going on the rest of the day. But I'm going to stop here and now invite questions from the audience in the time that we have left for any of the panelists. So please raise your hands. I think the first one right at the back.
Question is to Mridula Ramesh. We spoke about a decade back on integration of rivers. What is your take on that?
It's exactly what he said. You know, some parts of the country get a lot of water, some parts are very dry. So the logic is very clear. Transport water from wet places to dry. And in politics, it's important to be seen to be doing something substantial to help. And you know, these are substantial expenditures. You're seen to help. It ticks all the boxes. And the good thing is also they add storage to it, which India's terrible in the kind of water storage we have. So they've done that. Okay, this is the thing. There is one. There are two cons I have against it, and other people have said it also. One is, when do you want water? You want water in the summer when you don't have water. So as Tamil Nadu, I'm complete downstream state. Okay, I beg to everybody else. We know there is a thing. No, if Andhra is supposed to give me water, there's already rivers that are interlinked. Okay, they will never give in the summer and during El Nino years when Madras desperately needs water. When will they give? When Madras is already submerged. Okay, appa ella thanniyum thardu vitruvaanga. So this is a problem. You will, you know, like kodukra deivam koriya pichittu kodukra mari that will happen. That's one problem. Second, we also will, you know, what is, when you start seeing a proposal like this, what else co-benefit can you get from this? They'll think power. At that time, what do? They will cut forest. Okay, the moment, I mean, I've written extensively about why forests are integral to the water management of India, forest including grasslands. No, because people just say, oh, the pulladane onnu pannadu. It really is quite important. And if you cut forests, which are very important in storing water, you know, within a season, with trying to balance out the variation of water, not really accomplishing your goal. So I think, you know, there are pros and cons, but I have a feeling it's going to happen because politically it ticks all the boxes.
Okay. See, ஒரு தெருக்குழாயில் தண்ணீர் எடுக்க போகிறோம். நான் 4 குடம் பிடிச்சிடுறேன். பிகாஸ் என்னுடைய ஒரு சக்தியினால் அல்ல 2 பேர் போய் 4 குடம் பிடிச்சிடுறோம், 5 குடம் பிடிச்சிடுறோம். ஒரு குடத்துக்கு நான் கொடுக்கறதில்ல. ஒரு குடம் எடுக்கிறவங்களுக்கு இன்னொரு குடமும் தண்ணீர் அனுமதிக்கிறது இல்லை. நம்ம வந்து டெட்ராய்ட் ஆஃப் வாட் இஸ் இட் இந்தியன் டெட்ராய்ட் நம்ம சென்னையை சொல்கிறோம். எவ்வளவோ ஒரு கார் தயாரிக்கிறதுக்கு எவ்வளவோ கேலன்ஸ் ஆஃப் வாட்டர் வேஸ்ட் பண்ணுறோம். ஆனால் நம்ம வந்து எளிய மக்கள்கிட்ட வந்து தண்ணீரை நீங்கள் சேமிக்கணுங்கிறத நம்ம சொல்கிறோம், எளிய மக்கள்கிட்ட சொல்கிறோம். ஆனால் அது நம்மளால் பெரியவங்கள்ட்ட சொல்ல முடியல, பெரிய கார்பரேட்ஸ்கிட்ட சொல்ல முடியல.
இல்லை சார், நான் ஒன்றே ஒன்று சொல்கிறேன். இது வந்து எல்லா கம்பெனிகள்கிட்டையும் நான் ரொம்ப கிளியராக சொல்லிட்டேன். ஓகே, ஒரு ட்ரவுட் வந்ததுன்னா, ஒரு கலெக்டர் அங்கே இருந்தாங்கன்னா, த பெக்கிங் ஆர்டர் கோஸ் லைக் திஸ்: ட்ரிங்கிங் வாட்டர் ஃபர்ஸ்ட், farmers second, the company will be shut down. Okay, Tuticorin பார்த்தீங்கன்னா 2016-17 it suffered, it had one of the lowest rainfall it had in many years. The coal plants were shut, the bottling plants were shut, there were riots. So நீங்க சொல்றீங்க ஆமா, it's very unfair. Water மாதிரி ஒரு unfair-ஆன subject உலகத்தில் கிடையாது. But when push comes to shove, companies are also shut down.
Yes. We want the climate not to change, but we don't change. See, we beg, you said correctly that word, you used, we beg water. You rightly said about the Krishna water. I want to mention about Kaveri water also. See, what happens? They are very adamant in not letting Kaveri go. See, in Sangam literature, in Salapadikaram, we celebrated. Even now we celebrate Kaveri. Nadandai Vadi Kaveri. But what happens?
Thank you. I think the point has been made.
Politics.
Thank you so much. I have a question from outside, and given that they've not been able to be inside the hall, one question, which I will direct to Sukumar. Landless, socially excluded communities in climate mitigation and resilience measures, how to really stimulate a community-led movement.
I think I should pass this on to Mridula because she is the one who's working with people, and I don't really think I'm an expert on that. All that
No, but even the work that you did on human-animal conflict, how do you rally local communities?
Yeah. No, I think, see, first thing is that we have to be conscious of the need and sufferings of the poorest sections of society. Sudhaji spoke about compassion, and that is the first and the most important thing. And sometimes even in conservation in my own field, I don't see that, unfortunately, when it comes to conflict. It's almost like, the elephant is taking its revenge, and thou shalt suffer, irrespective of the consequences or whatever. It is a very unfortunate thing that's actually happening from a certain section of our society. But on the other hand, first is to, I think, recognize their need and their suffering. And once that starts, and we start paying attention to their requirements, whether it's what I mean, Mridula just said, that first is drinking water, and then you go to the next step, agriculture, production of food, and then to the corporations, production of goods, and so on and so forth. I think that's a very sensible approach. I mean, that's all I can say at this stage. I'm not a sociologist who knows how to, work with local communities or whatever.
Very quickly, our research on tanks, we looked at what historically bound communities together. There's always a sense of benefits that you get. Communities just don't do something because if they don't see repetitive, tangible benefits. In tanks, there's enormous caste dynamics there, so I'm going to gloss over a little bit of that. There's like temple rights, there's dharma, there's karmic points. I've gone through that in the books. I'm really moving thing. But for the landless communities, right? There was fishing income. There was a lot of the more underprivileged thing, livestock becomes very important. So if you look at cash flow, that becomes, so I think whenever you frame a solution and you want to get the communities along, you have to keep in mind, how are you creating regular cash flow from whatever intervention that you're making so that they stay vested in the process?
Great. I think we have time for one last question. So maybe the gentleman with the mic in his hand, and then...
First is for Sukumar. Of course, your refers to this paper you mentioned about Sandinala peat bogs. And, where you mentioned herbivores, of course, you mentioned in your paper that it's bovine, right? Bovine fungal, fecal material. So how do you counter the possible query that it might have been from other bovine herbivores like Indian gaur? And the second question, I'll just finish, it's meant for Mridula. And that is, do you think that we are kind of losing out on the sanctity of water? Because, the Toda people, they have water sources, about 5 different water sources around some of their principal hamlets. And what is to be used for the dairy temple use cannot be touched by a layperson. What is to be used for the ordination of a priest cannot be touched by a layperson. What is used to be for the pregnancy rites, what is used to be for domestic use, all segregated. Only 25 people living in that one hamlet. The dairy temples function principally during the driest parts of the year. They need the water. They know which are the hydrologic conserving species. So do you think that in India, this was the tradition, which is still seen in some of these communities today, of sanctity of water and what we've lost out on?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I thought a lot about it. Couldn't it be an eruption of gaur populations in in this region, for instance? It could have been, in principle, but unlikely to that kind of a response. For a bovine population to increase to that extent. So most probably, if you take the total evidence and put it together, it's much more likely to have been, human fecal matter, the charcoal with fires, the spread of grasslands and all that. Much more likely to have been a corral site, where today it's a sheep breeding farm there, okay, at Sandinella. Most likely people were, it's a corral for buffaloes or whatever. That's the most likely explanation. Yeah.
I come from Madurai, so I'm going to end with a quick story. Madurai is famous for the Meenakshi Amman temple, right? And the Meenakshi Amman temple has something called the Thiruvilayadu, where the divine sports of Shiva. And I'm going to tell one story. It's in my book also, so I'll say it very quickly. Once upon a time, the Vaigai was in spate. And before, not too long ago, Madurai was a river fort city. The Vaigai was in spate, and the king said everybody has to contribute labor to build a bund to prevent the city from being flooded. There was an old woman called Vandiyammai. She was old, she lived alone, and she sold puttu, which is like these rice cakes. And she had no one to help, so she went around saying, "No, I'll give you puttu, can someone help me out?" Nobody helped out. So finally Shiva came and said, "I will help you. You give me the puttu." But he ate the puttu and slept off. Okay? And the king's guards found him and hit him with a stick. And the story goes that every person in Madurai felt the blow. There are two messages from this. Even the gods are not exempt from the laws of water management. Right? That's number one. And number two, because everyone felt the blow, water management is everybody's thing. I mean, our greatest goddesses were water. It was sacred.
Thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there, but please join me in thanking Sukumar and Mridula for a wonderful session. Well done.